tech guru. So if there's any questions, please don't hesitate. I'm going to turn it right over to Pam, but if you do have any questions throughout the presentation today, please don't hesitate to ask. You can pop your questions in the chat. You also have the ability to unmute yourself if you prefer to um, do your question that way. All right, let's get started.
All right, so I'm sharing, but let me just double check that you can see. Are you seeing my whole screen or are you seeing the presentation?
We're seeing the presentation, but not in the presenter mode.
I know it. I don't know why it's not doing that. So it's not going in. Resume slideshow. Let's try that. Can you see it now?
Yes. Now we're
Oh,
seeing the
great.
correct screen too. And
Great. Thank you. Okay. Hello, for those of you who came back, thank you. And those of you who are newly joining and didn't attend the first one is recorded and I believe on WCASA's website, correct, Angie? Or will be at some point.
it's on our YouTube page. And I
Oh, perfect.
will
Thank
I
you.
will share out the recording to everyone at the end of all the
Perfect.
recordings at the end in August.
Great, great, perfect. So, today's training is trauma and disability. Some of the information in this training will be repeat as far as most of you should have a pretty good foundation of trauma and what that looks like and why it happens and how it represents itself in various ways. But I'm going to do just a quick overview of trauma and then talk more specifically about trauma and individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and how that might be a little different and how that might impact either their behaviors or society's labels that they attach to that when somebody has been sexually assaulted. So let's move forward. Let's see. Here we go. All right. So, what is trauma? Trauma is an event or circumstance resulting in either physical harm, emotional harm, or life-threatening harm. Anyone can experience trauma no matter their age, gender, race, sexual orientation, or ability. And perceptions of trauma can vary between individuals. I think as advocates and the roles that we all play in the work that we do, we understand that there is no like, this is a bigger trauma than this is, because it really is individually interpreted by that person who's experienced the trauma. So, whatever it is that they perceive as their experience, whether it's, I've had some people who are sexually harassed who had a very large reaction. And then I've had some people who've been sexually assaulted or raped, and they've had a much smaller reaction. And that doesn't mean that one is bigger or worse than the other. It's really about that individual perception and how it impacts them and how their history looks as well. Because if this is repeated abuse or repeated trauma, that can impact them as well. So, why does trauma occur? Trauma occurs as a way of protecting ourselves from bad, painful, or scary things. When an event is traumatic, our brain logs it as something we don't want to happen again. It does this by recording the event as information in the brain, but also as a physical experience in the body, hence triggers of trauma. Or now we're getting away from the word triggers and using more activation of response or, other words that are less traumatic, for lack of a better word. But it is something that our body physically feels or reacts to within that trauma. So, examples of traumatic experiences may include, but are not limited to, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, neglect of any form, sudden, unexplained separation from loved ones, poverty, racism, discrimination, oppression, violence in a family, home, or community, and so much more, right? Trauma is a regular occurrence, probably in this world people are experiencing trauma every day in various forms. It just it just appears differently for different people and it's experienced differently for different people. All right, so how does trauma and disability intersect? So, and I want to open this up as well for those of you that weren't on the last training. If you have a question directly related to what I'm saying or want to share an experience or a comment, please feel free to write something in the chat. Angie, I believe, is going to monitor that and will break in when appropriate, or I'll take a pause and just check to see if anybody has any questions. All right. So, historical response to trauma in vulnerable populations. So, historically, segregation of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities has contributed to high rates of trauma in people with IDD and decreased community-based services that are accessible to people with IDD. So what does that look like? So we know what the word segregation is. It's used in a lot of different forms of trauma and our history in this country. But segregation still is happening to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and it has throughout history. I didn't put it in this training, but if any of you want to um, Google Geraldo. I don't know. I'm older than many people on this training, but Geraldo did a report many years ago at a state institution in on the East Coast, and it was. I'm gonna give you a warning if you watch it. It is very disturbing. It is very concerning, but it opened the world's eyes to the fact that people with disabilities were being the only way I can say warehoused or dumped into institutions. And people, family members were being told that giving their child to the state as a ward of the state was best for their child, not knowing what these situations looked like, what these institutions looked like. I think I said in my first training that I had a sibling who had Down syndrome and he died 2 months into his life, and that's my first living memory. But that was when I was two. So over 55 years ago, my parents were told that he wouldn't live past 13 and that they should give him up to the state. That's not that long ago. So that is still like a thought process that happens sometimes. And then now we maybe don't do it in such a abrupt way, but we still do it in ways where there are schools in our state that are segregated schools just for people with disabilities. If you talk to families and people who work there, you will get varying perspectives of they love them or they hate them, but it is still what we would call segregation. And it's separation from the community as a whole. And part of the concern about that is that if you're put into a large population of people with disabilities and only seen by the people who work there, then the degree of abuse that could come into your life, a degree of trauma is much higher than if you have people around your community seeing and caring about you and checking in with you and things like that. It's easier to overlook, sometimes minimize all of those power and control things that we talked about, um, that we will talk about and we've talked about before in all of our work. That happens a lot more when nobody has oversight and nobody is speaking up for the individuals. So that's a concern. So initial understandings of trauma in the 20th century allowed society to blame individuals for their abnormal behaviors, abnormal being what we're going to call disability, because that's the way that they talked about disability in those days, rather than looking at the environment for causing those behaviors, right? So um, many behaviors came out of the institutionalization and the way they were treated, as opposed to because of their disability. So I worked a number of years ago with um, an older gentleman who lived in an institution in Wisconsin. So Wisconsin used to have I believe, four state institutions. Um, Two of them are closed, two of them remain, but they're supposed to kind of close due to natural attrition as soon as the people who do stay there are pass away and age out. But he was put in an institution when he was young because his parents told him to do that. And he got out and got into the community and worked with me to do trainings for people around the state and around our community here. And one of the things that, if you looked at him, you would see he has these really large ears and they're kind of oddly shaped. And so he explained when we would do trainings, we would have a conversation with each other. And he explained that when his staff was angry at him or wanted to punish him, they would clap his ears really hard with their hands. And eventually he lost some hearing and his ears got misshapen. And that was about abuse, but nobody really called it that. And to my knowledge, nobody got impacted by being told on or said that that was happening. So that's just a very small example. But if you talk to him or Cindy Bentley, who I think many of you have probably met along the way, she does a lot of training. She works at People First Wisconsin. She's the first executive director with an intellectual disability in the country. She will talk about institutional trauma and abuse that happened. And she was literally put in there because they called her a wild animal. But, she was burned in foster care. She was abused continually when she got there. She was abused as well. So they were not good places. And that institutionalization certainly caused a lot of trauma. And we still have a lot of those individuals in our communities that are either being segregated or living through that trauma still. All right, so why are people with disabilities more likely to experience traumatic events? Institutionalization, like I talked about, we may not call some of what we do institutionalization anymore, but if you think about it, probably every one of your communities has an agency that probably is sold to the public as a really good agency that houses people with disabilities during the day. And they all go there and they may work or they may learn job skills or they may have socialization, but we called them sheltered workshops for many years. So there's still forms of institutionalization that are happening all over the state and all over the country. And trauma happens more in those situations, as I have talked before. Separation from caregivers. So if the families are told that their children were better off with the state, which they don't do that so much anymore, but we still do find ways to kind of put them in situations where they're separated from oversight of families. And then sometimes families can be the abusers as well. So that can have more trauma. Invasive or non-consensual medical procedures. There have been forced sterilization on women with intellectual and developmental disabilities over the years. There's been other forced medical procedures. Individuals with mental health and intellectual disabilities sometimes are forced into some procedures. I think, we all know of stories that we've heard about people with mental health disabilities being forced into some not so nice procedures because of their um, mental health and because society claims or the doctors claim that that's best for them and not necessarily by choice. Sexual and financial victimization. So people with disabilities are much more likely to be sexually abused and also taken advantage of financially. Psychological, physical, emotional abuse, and neglect. So all of those are reasons why the trauma is experienced as a higher rate. All right, so here's the power and control stuff that I'd referred to before. I know that we're all really familiar with power and control in the work that we do, but I don't know that we're all really familiar about power and control when it comes to people with disabilities. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to pause for a second. Angie, is there anything we need to cover?
So far, there are no questions, but just a
Okay,
reminder, if you do have any, please feel free to ask them.
great, thank you. All right, so what does power and control look like for people with disabilities? So these are all the same kind of power and control issues, but they look differently for different reasons for people with disabilities. So intimidation, people with disabilities are often told what to do, how to do it, where to do it, when to do it, and if they can do it. And if they don't do those things, they're often scolded like a parent would scold a child or worse. And they're often told that if they don't do something that they will have repercussions. So that creating fear and creating intimidation around their experience is used against them on a very frequent basis. People even somewhat justify, people as in caregivers or people in their circle, justify it by saying, well, they need to know what to do, so I'm telling them what to do. But I don't know if any of you grew up with a dad like my dad, but my dad didn't have to say much for me to have some fear that if I didn't move like right now, that there was going to be a consequence. So I didn't necessarily even need that verbiage to be said. It was the look sometimes or the action that the person did. And caregivers or people who are abusing individuals with disabilities do that. It might even be family members, and take advantage of that to get them to comply. Caregiver privilege, I've seen this many times. Even in the work that I've done, I've gone to uh, a SANE exam with an individual with a disability, and I had the police ask the caregiver if they thought the person was telling the truth. And the caregiver said, nah, they lie all the time. They're answering for them, they're dismissing, but the caregiver in this circumstance was actually the abuser. But they were looking to say, that the caregiver had more clout, more validity than the person with the disability. Denying privacy, people with disabilities, all people have the right to privacy. The truth is that oftentimes that dignity of privacy is taken away. Oh, it's no big deal. Just get dressed here. Get undressed for the shower. I need to watch you to make sure you shower. And they're doing it because they think that's their job, but it still kind of becomes intimidating. And I don't know, I don't want anybody watching me take a shower or telling me that I'm not washing myself the right way. So those kinds of things can be degrading and humiliating, but there also a part of power and control. Um, Emotional abuse, punishing, refusing to listen to, ignoring, or mocking. I'm not going to name names, but we have some people in pretty high places in this country that have on national TV mocked people with disabilities, and many people thought that that was just fine. So if that person in that seat can do that, we know it's happening everywhere. Making fun of, making them feel like less than, minimizing or blaming or gaslighting. Again, we know that this happens in abuse in general, but with people with disabilities, your word is not taken as your word. It's dismissed, it's minimized. They may even blame the person for causing the abuse. If you wouldn't have done this, then I wouldn't have had to do this, that kind of thing. Withholding supports, denying medication, misusing medication, sedation, taking needed equipment away, denying access, refusing to use communication devices. Sadly, I've seen every single one of these done before in the many capacities of people with disabilities that I have worked in. I've seen some people give extra meds or their PRN meds, which is as needed meds, when they weren't needed, but they knew that it would quiet them down and then the staff wouldn't have to work so hard that night or could maybe have somebody come over that wasn't supposed to come over or whatever that was, or abuse them possibly. Um, Denying medication and then reporting that the person was out of control or had behavior issues just to get back at them or just to somehow make them feel less than, taking away communication devices or equipment. So I had one case a while back that the caregiver just unplugged the electric wheelchair in the back, and the individual couldn't turn her wheelchair back on. So even though she was in the middle of the kitchen, it was still like he'd locked her in a room and she couldn't get away from him because she had no means to move her chair or get herself away from him. So those kind of things can be used around abuse or power and control. And then economic abuse, using their money for personal gain, stealing their stuff, things of that nature. All right, so I wanted to address some disability abuse statistics because I think this kind of puts it in a better light for all of us to compare it to the statistics that we probably all know by heart for people without disabilities. So people with intellectual disabilities are sexually assaulted at 7 times the rate of people without disabilities. So if we took away the word disabilities, what would the rate be? So 1 in 3 women is usually the statistic that you hear, and 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 men, depending on what study you're looking at. So if it's 7 times greater, then that's pretty large because 1 in 3 is large. If you add 7 times greater than that, I think honestly, it's probably most people with disabilities will be assaulted or experience some sort of abuse. So I think I saw a question pop up. Angie, was there a question?
Not a question, I don't think, just a comment.
Hmm.
I've heard of a caregiver here in Madison trigger the person on purpose so they would behave aggressively, so that the police had to tase the person and take them to jail due to the domestic violence mandatory arrest law of quote unquote harming the caregiver that they live with. And the caregiver did this so that they didn't have to deal with the person.
Yeah, and that's much like I had referenced earlier when somebody doesn't give meds or gives too much medication. Part of that sometimes is to cause a behavior that somehow then can either make the caregiver's life easier or make the client look crazy or the family member to look like out of control or whatever those words are that are used to describe that. And in this situation, domestic violence, it was in the same home, it sounds like. Um, I'm just going to put a little plug and I'll talk later about our services. But if something like that comes past your desk or in your purview, Disability Rights Wisconsin would be a great referral for that so that we can help with some of that and have help them navigate that if that's what is found to be the case. So don't be afraid to have them or somebody they care about call on their behalf and we can look to see if we can support them or help them in some way. Higher rates of violence overall for women with disabilities. I think that, that makes sense. Women in general have a higher rate of being abused, but then if you add a disability, it's one more layer of vulnerability or just kind of not having that power or having that power taken away. Higher rates of violence committed against persons with cognitive disabilities than any other disabilities. So I often do a training for parents of young adults with disabilities, and I'll ask them, think about how many people have access to your child in one day. And most of the time, they're children with intellectual disabilities or cognitive disabilities. That's in school. Sometimes they use that wording instead. Um, and I will get numbers like, oh, 150 people have access to my kid in one day. And if you think about that, there's bound to be great people that are doing the right thing, but there's also bound to be a handful of people who have bad intentions, who likely take the job because it gives them access to vulnerable individuals, things of that nature. So it doesn't really shock me that there's higher rates. Many people with intellectual disabilities need many supports in their life. So the more people who have access to their personal body and their personal space, the more likely there's going to be abuse. So figuring that out and protecting somebody is kind of this, it's a lot, a heavy load to lift to figure out how do we make sure that they're safe and that the individuals that come into their life are safe as well. 1 in 5 violent crime victims with disabilities believe they were targeted due to their disabilities. I think that that's very true. And one of the ways that we just had a police interview that I had yesterday with a woman who was assaulted by a caregiver. And we knew of one when we went into the interview, we came out with four. And there's no doubt that she was targeted because it was somebody who worked in the home that she was at. And he knew when she wouldn't have anybody else in the home because he knew the schedule, he knew her schedule, he knew that she was lonely and he played upon some of her feelings around that. There were all sorts of things that he played upon, but he definitely, knowing her disability and knowing about her vulnerability, he took advantage of that. So we will likely charge that case as third-degree sexual assault with a hate crime enhancer because the individual targeted the person due to their disability. And sometimes we try to do a second-degree inability to give consent, but most people with disabilities can give consent. It's just that you can't prove that they did or didn't. It's that he said, she said thing. If you can say that it's the person knew about the disability and targeted them because of it, now it's about the perp's behavior and not about the victim's behavior. It's about proving that the perp understood that they had a disability and what to do to take advantage of that disability. And the onus is on the behavior of the person who did the crime as opposed to the victim. And then less than 3% of victims with disabilities report. And I think that's, pretty commonly a statistic that we see around other victims as well. But we'll talk a little bit about why that is. So the factors that contribute to increased risk, I talked about a few of these things, but isolation is one of them. I used to work at a group home, oh gosh, a very long time ago, before I had children. Um, BC and AC, before children and after children. So it was BC. Um, and I initially, when I started working there, I was like, wow, these guys have a great social schedule. Like every day it was something. Monday nights we went bowling. Tuesday nights we went to the Y. Wednesday nights, like every day was kind of a social thing. And then the more I observed and watched behaviors and what was going on, the more I realized that just because you have a social thing on your calendar and you're told to go there doesn't mean that you're feeling social or that you're not feeling isolated. I mean, how many of you have been in a room where there's 100 people and you're still lonely or you're still feeling like you don't know anybody and you're kind of standing in the background, right? So you could put a big group of people with disabilities together. That doesn't mean that they're all wanting to be there, socializing in a way that's meaningful. It might mean that there's one staff, one vehicle, and everybody's going to go whether they want to or not. And that can still be isolating. So, isolation, dependence on others, we talked a little bit about that already. How, being dependent on others for bathing or for medications or for transportation or whatever that need is in their life. There's a lot of people that they need, and some of these people are bad actors. Not aware of their rights. I often say not aware of their right to say no, but also not aware of their right to say yes. Because sometimes we have situations where families will say that their adult daughter, adult son has been sexually assaulted. And when we take the time to have a conversation with the individual, not with the parents or not with the caregivers, we find out that that individual was having a consensual relationship. I mean, it takes a little while to get to that, to make sure, but it's the parents sometimes who are saying, well, my son or daughter will never have sex because they're never going to get married. So therefore, anytime there's sexual behavior, it is abuse. And that is not always the case. So kind of weeding that out is something that sometimes has to be done, but not being aware of their right to say no, and also their right to say yes. Not educated about their bodies, boundaries, healthy relationships, or sex. Again, that's part of the fourth training that we're going to have, and that's going to talk about the curriculum that I wrote that will hopefully be something that's a good tool for people to use. Not educated about abuse. I've strongly believed for years if you don't know what healthy relationships are, then you don't know what unhealthy or abuse looks like. And therefore, that's part of that 3% of why they're not telling, because they don't know that what's happening to them is abuse. It may be so normalized to them because that's what grandpa or dad or caregiver said love looks like, that they're going to um, not red flag that situation. Learned compliance. So that's a big deal in the world of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I liken it to when you have children, or if you have children around you that when they're little, you tell them, go do this, or don't do that, and they listen to you. And eventually they start growing up and they say, but why? And sometimes we say, because I told you so, or because I'm your mom, or whatever that is. But eventually they push back even further and they say, no, why? And we have to start giving them explanations, which is how they grow into autonomy, which means that they start making choices for themselves, sometimes safe, sometimes unsafe, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. But they're learning how to make choices and to take risks by weighing out what those choices and consequences are. People with intellectual disabilities often don't get to the point that the people around them allow them to find that autonomy. And they're told, well, mom just knows what's best for you, or caregiver knows what's best for you. And as they age, each factor, there's another person in their life that says, just look to me and I'll tell you what's best for you. Well, that's great until the person telling them what's best for them is an abuser. And then what happens? So if we're not giving them the tools to see when it isn't something they want, or to choose not to be in that situation, or to know to get away from a situation, then we're teaching them to comply with what's going on, and then abusers take advantage of that. Deprivation of attention and affection. If I could leave you with one thing today, it is that people with disabilities want to feel loved and connected to other people in the same way that all of us do. And part of what perpetrators do, abusers do, is they play on that affection. They play on that deprivation of attention. And they say, your mom treats you like a little girl, but I'm going to treat you like a woman. I'm going to marry you someday. I'm going to help you know what real women do, or whatever that is that they're saying. But they're really kind of playing on that I need to feel needed kind of piece. The woman yesterday that I said that we went for one and there were four in the interview, she said, I wanted a boyfriend and I thought he was going to be my boyfriend because that's what he told me while he's abusing her, while he's paid to be her caregiver, while he comes into her home every day and knows her schedule and knows how to manipulate the situation so that he can abuse her. So that lack of connectedness and lack of social and intimate relationships, I think, is a big key factor. If we can somehow give them the tools to find that connectedness, we might impact some of the numbers that we've seen today. And then lack of control over life's choices. There's a lot of people in this world who work with people with disabilities who think they're doing it with the greatest intentions and they just get it wrong. I had a woman I worked with for a number of years. She lived in her own apartment, had a job in the community, and had staff come into her house, her apartment, like twice a week, I think, to work on a menu, to go grocery shopping, and to help kind of with bills and writing checks and things like that. And she was always told, keep your door locked and don't let strangers into your house. So somebody knocked on her door. The door was locked. She looked through the peephole. She saw faces of people that she knew. So she opened the door, and a man with a number of friends walked into her house. They physically abused her, sexually abused her, and then they stole some of her property. And she was upset and confused and didn't know what to do. And staff came over that night and said, "Where's your TV?" And she's like, I don't know, because she was afraid she was in trouble. That's typical behavior, right? Of victims where they kind of like blame themselves or don't know what to do. So eventually, well, they started accusing her of selling it and using the money for things that she shouldn't have used her money on. So eventually she told what happened. They took her to the police station and said she had to tell. That's taking away a choice, right? They, the police took the report, and it wasn't a linear report, right? People with trauma don't tell a linear story often, but the police ended up saying, we just can't make head or tails of this. So we're just not going to do anything. But they knew who the guys were. So the guys lived in her building. So she had met them at the mailbox. When she'd get her mail, they'd say hi. So were they strangers? We'd probably all still say yes. But because they'd said hi to her, when she looked through that peephole and saw a face she knew, she let them in. So the police went to the men and said, if you return her property, then we won't press charges. And they did. So she got her property back. And then her staff, my belief is thought they needed to do something. They didn't know what. So they moved her. Um, to an apartment on the second floor in the same building. I don't know how that accomplished anything other than telling her very clearly that if she tells again, she's not going to get any choices and people are going to take all that choice away from her. And so friends of hers have told me she's been abused since then, but she's not reported it because she doesn't want to move again. She doesn't want to feel like she did it wrong or did something wrong or was in trouble again. So, lack of control over life's choices is a real thing that happens. So, what are the barriers to reporting? Lack of knowledge of rights and abuse. I had talked about that earlier. Fear of retribution or losing a caregiver. I've had some individuals tell me um, that they'd rather have 10 minutes of abuse and, 8 hours of a good caregiver than not knowing when they fire that caregiver what kind of caregiver they're getting next. That could be 8 hours of abuse or 8 hours of horror or what neglect or whatever it is. For them to acknowledge that that's the choice that they make is really, there's something wrong with our system, but that is an actual reality that sometimes is faced. Fear of not being believed. I think all victims feel that. Fear of retaliation. What if they tell and the company and the police or whoever it is don't believe them and that caregiver stays in that role? And that is a reality that happens. I've had maybe 4 or 5 caregiver cases in the last, I don't know, since the beginning of the year, and most of them retained their job. So that's a reality that really exists. Don't know where or how to report. So are your services something that people with disabilities know about? Do they know where to go or who to call or how to call? And if they have to go somewhere, can they get there? So accessibility of the services. I've had many advocates tell me we can't transport somebody or we can't go to their home and meet with them. Well, if they don't have access to transportation and they don't have a way to either get to the hospital or your office or talk to you, then that's really isolation. So thinking about that when we're planning who we serve, I think is really important. Any questions at all, Angie?
So far, no.
Okay, thanks. So, what does trauma in people with disabilities, what does it look like? So, different ways it can manifest itself. Have you ever heard a client or a victim be called aggressive or manipulative or a behavior problem, or that they have high risk behavior, at risk behavior, criminal behavior? That sometimes is the way they're communicating their trauma. Now, it's not the best way to get help, but trauma doesn't come up to us in the best way. It comes out in the way that our body is reacting in that moment or our brain is reacting. And we don't always have control over what that looks like. People with disabilities have these labels thrown around all the time. They're manipulative. They are attention seeking. They are, like all these labels that come out, and those labels are used against them. But what if those things that they're doing are ways that they're trying to scream loudly, help me, I need some help? So understanding that those labels, if we turn them around and think about them through the terms of trauma, that there may be a grasp for help or looking for some sort of services or support. So, what kind of labels do individuals with disabilities have? Non-compliant, uncontrollable, defiant. Um, Even just in those words, manipulative, behavior issue, power and control is all over those descriptive words that we're using there. So, one of the ways that I talk to the clientele that I work with about trauma, because using kind of the technical trauma words don't always translate in a way that makes sense. And using plain language, and we had talked a little bit about that before, is the best way to communicate with anybody, but specifically with people with disabilities, putting it in a format that they understand. So, what I will do is I will talk about that in each one of us, there's this, I either say like a box or like a Tupperware. I know that makes me sound old too, but one of those containers that you put the cover on, you push down. And every time something bad happens to us, trauma, right? We put it in there and we put the cover on because we don't want to deal with the feelings. We don't want to deal with the fears or whatever's coming out of that. And that's pretty typical for all of us. But every time we go through a trauma, we stick it in there. Eventually, when you put the lid back on, it does one of two things. It leaks. And I explain to the clientele I work with, the leaking might look like I'm crying and I don't know why. I'm angry and I don't know why. I'm promiscuous and I don't know why. I'm eating a ton of food, not because I'm hungry. I don't know why though. Any of those kind of behavior things that we see that come out of trauma. And then if we if you push a cover really hard onto something that's really full, or if you put it in the microwave and you forgot to like pop the seal, it like explosively comes off, right? So I always think of spaghetti sauce in a container because I've done this, where the cover comes off and like your whole microwave is full of like red sauce everywhere and it's very messy. And so if you're not leaking, then you're exploding. And the exploding could be a mental health breakdown. It could be where you might have to be hospitalized or medicated in a way that helps you deal with some of that. So I talk to them about how do we find ways to open that box and take one thing out at a time so that you don't start leaking and that doesn't blow up at some point. And we talk about counseling and what does that look like, or talk therapy or whatever that might be that they need. So, interestingly, I've used this for years, and about 3 years ago, I had someone who I'd worked with two sexual assaults through. She has an intellectual disability and some mental health disability. She has a guardian. And I got a message on my phone. It came from a number I didn't know. There was no name attached to it, but the person said, Pam, I'm leaking. I need help. And so I could tell by the voice that it was this client, and I called her guardian, found out where she was, and we connected. But I thought, you know what? She heard that message. That made sense to her that when some of the stuff was happening, instead of going, I don't know why, she could put a thing on it that said, I'm leaking. So, a tool that I use that if you want to use or if you think of something similar, it just helps put the words together for them. All right, so I'm going to play this little video. My sound should be on. Cross your fingers.
Through history, people with physical and mental disabilities have been abandoned at birth, banished from society, used as court jesters, drowned and burned during the integration glass in Nigeria, Germany, still continue to be segregated, institutionalized, tortured in the name of behavioral management, abused, raped, euthanized, and murdered.
Now, for the first time, people with disabilities are taking their rightful place as fully contributing citizens.
The danger is that we will respond with remediation and benevolence rather than equity and respect. And so we offer you a credo for support. Do not see my disability as the problem. Recognize that my disability is an attribute.
Do not see my disability as a deficit. It's you who see me as deviant and helpless.
Do not try to fix me because I am not broken. Support me. I can make my own contributions to my community in my own way.
Do not see me as a client. I am your fellow citizen. See me as your neighbor. Remember, none of us can be self-sufficient.
Do not try to modify my behavior. Be still and listen. What you define as inappropriate may be my attempt to communicate with you in the only way I can.
Do not try to change me. You have no voice. Help me learn what I want to know.
Do not hide my uncertainty behind professional distance. Being a person who listens, it is not my struggle away, but trying might take it all better.
Do not use theories and strategies on me. Be with me when we struggle with each other. Let that give rise to self-reflection.
Do not try to control me. I have a right to my power. What you call non-compliance or manipulation may actually be the only way I can exert some control over my life.
Do not be charitable towards me. The last thing the world needs is another Jerry Lewis. Be my ally against those who explore me for their own gratification.
Do not try to be my friend. I deserve more than that. Get to know me. We may become friends.
Do not help, even if it does make you feel good. Ask if I need your help. Let me show you how you can best assist me.
Do not admire me. A desire to live a full life does not warrant adoration. Respects me, for respect pursues equity.
Do not tell, correct, or lead. Listen, support, and follow.
Do not work on me. Work with me.
The credo of support is dedicated to the memory of Tracy That's where Norman, Cook, and Emma Van Der Klept created Credo of Support.
I always lean on the fact that hearing directly from individuals with disabilities is better than just hearing from me, an able-bodied woman. So, all right. So how can we address these issues? I think this is all stuff that we know instead of what is wrong with you, what has happened to you, giving time and space for listening. It may take longer to listen, but make sure you have enough time to listen. My first SANE exam with an individual with cerebral palsy, for the police interview, the SANE exam, and all of the pieces was over 8 hours. And none of us showed this young man that we didn't want to be there, because that then closes down the lines of communication. So understanding that it just may take more time, but we're there to help them with whatever they need, or at least get them connected to resources. So speaking of resources, well, also then assuming competence. So just because somebody has a disability does not mean that they have an intellectual disability or a guardian, and doesn't mean that they can't make choices for themselves. So be trauma informed, ask and listen, communicate to be understood, build rapport, slow it down, and understand that it may take longer. So resources. I went over this last time, but I'm going to go over it each time just to remind you about who we are and what we do. So Disability Rights Wisconsin is the protection and advocacy agency for the state of Wisconsin. Every state and territory has a protection and advocacy agency in the country. We have been the protection and advocacy agency since 1977. Sometimes you'll hear us refer to ourselves as DRW, and the PNA, which is Protection and Advocacy Agency. So specifically, Victim Advocacy Program, which is the program that I work in, and many other attendees on this session work with me. We have attorneys and advocates, and we work with victims of crime with disabilities, mostly around sexual abuse, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and caregiver abuse. We do have some funding that allows us to go outside of that box, but it's limited. So the services that we provide: personal advocacy, victim accompaniment, information referral, criminal justice support, limited advocacy for civil and family law proceedings. We have phenomenal attorneys that know restraining orders, know guardianship law, know family law, and can represent the crime victim sometimes, not criminals, the crime victim. So sometimes that's necessary just to make sure that the individual's rights are being followed. Access to services, understanding the systems, safety planning. And the biggest thing that all of you should be aware of is that we wrote our grant in a way that we can co-advocate with local advocacy. So if somebody with a disability comes into your agency, you can connect with us, or have them connect with us, or have them give you permission to connect with us, and we can co-advocate together. And I truly feel that with your knowledge of your local services and our knowledge of disability services and victimization, that the victim can be better supported, and hopefully within that, the community can be safer, and accountability for the perpetrator can happen as well. So how can we work together? We are your allies. We have experience working with victims with disabilities. We have knowledge of disability law, language, and proof of disability. Yesterday, I had a prosecutor's office set up a meeting to talk about how do we support a victim with a disability through a trial. She's in an electric wheelchair. Her communication is harder to understand. So those kinds of things we can help with. Also had some calls around what's the best way to charge this? Where do I get proof of disability? And all of those things are things that we do regularly. So knowledge of the disability resources is something that we can definitely help with. Sometimes when we're working a case with a local organization, the local advocate takes the lead, and then we're the background for resources. Sometimes we take the lead and they're the background, and sometimes we just equally handle the load. So whatever's needed, and that's best for the client and the victim. So how do you refer to us? You can call us. Intake is a line that we'll answer. Right now, we don't have intake up because we're transferring to a new system, but you can call and ask for the victim advocacy program and talk to myself or Monica Kale, who is our supervising managing attorney. And she can get more information, and then we can decide. We have team meetings every week or two just to talk about cases that come in and whether or not they fit within the scope of our grants. And then we can get back to the victim or get back to you if you have the referral, that kind of information, or just talk through a circumstances. So that is it. I wanted to leave a little time, 2 minutes, for questions or anything that others might have.
I don't see anything. There hasn't been anything coming in.
Sounds good. So just a reminder, and Angie probably was planning on doing this, but I'm stepping on her toes, or on their toes, and so, that we have 2 more trainings. This is the second one. The next one, I believe, is guardianship and consent. And then the last one is about the curriculum that we've written. And anybody who attends the last one will get a free curriculum sent to them and information about how to go through the online training to use the curriculum.
Very excited for that one. I know that you've been working so hard on that curriculum, Pam, for so many years now.
Yes.
And it's amazing to finally the curriculum is in my bag right over there. But it's amazing to have it's a thick curriculum. It's big,
It
it's
is.
huge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's fabulous to see all of the years of the work that you have done, that the committee and everyone who's been involved in that, just to see that come to fruition. And curriculums are, especially in the funding challenges that programs have had over the years, getting a curriculum isn't always the easiest thing to do. So getting this curriculum that is written locally, that you have access to the people who have created it, who you can come to with any questions, is kind of rare. So I'm excited.
Yeah, and it's basically taking everything in my head that I've done the last 30 years, just kind of looking for a curriculum and not finding what I wanted, and put it down in writing so that it can live on beyond my life as an advocate, although I think I'll be an advocate forever. But someday I want to step away a little bit at least. So if I can share with all of you, that's my goal, is to make sure that there's good curriculum that's accessible and free to all of you. So, well, thank you all.